Hello and welcome to the presentation on human marriage. While marriage is not a universal among all humans, many people don't get married, it is an interesting phenomenon because it's a universal across all human societies. So every society that we know of so far has some form of marriage. Today we'll be talking about the different forms of marriage, what they entail, and how forms of marriage might be tied to local ecologies or respond to local ecologies. So marriage is a universal across all human societies, and as such, it's considered a legal contract. So while not all societies see marriage as this joining of two souls united in love, it is a legal contract. It's often socially agreed upon, economically based, and meant to legitimize any reproductive efforts. Often, marriage includes a formal ceremony and property exchange. This is to legitimize the contract in front of other members of the society. Property exchange is traditionally used to bind the contract, so this might be a dowry or a bride price. Bride price is the opposite of dowry, where the husband's family pays money or brings gifts to the wife's family. Or property exchange between the two individuals themselves. And we still see this today in the form of wedding gifts in modern day United States in general. Marriage also legitimizes children and, more importantly, inheritance rights. So, in one of the previous lectures, we discussed parental investment and marriage as a reproductive contract. Often describes inheritance rights of any offspring produced by the couple who is married. And in most societies, or at least for what we think of a majority of human history, marriage was a contract connecting larger family groups. You may be familiar with the concept of in-laws if you have any or are considering any. So your natal family group is now joined with your spouse's natal family group, and they become your in-laws. But in general, marriage is often a contract between two families where the couple or individuals who are being married are part of this contract of exchange between the two larger family groupings who now have some sort of alliance. And if you think about historically the royal houses of Europe, as this painting shows, often marriages were very political, and this is true of many societies around the world today. There are many dimensions to marriage. Who is allowed to marry? Do you have a choice in your spouse? Is your marriage arranged by others? Oftentimes these arranged marriages really do reflect that point here, where marriage is to connect larger family groups. How long should the marriage be? Is the marriage exclusive? So, can you get a divorce? Can either one of the partners take other partners in addition to yourself? How many men versus how many women? We'll talk about different marriage forms. Oftentimes, when there are either multiple wives married to one husband or multiple husbands married to one wife, those individuals are related to one another because it reduces interspouse competition. And social limitations. What sorts of social limitations are put on marriage? In some societies, marriage can be quite exclusive. So, currently in the United States, one spouse is only allowed to marry. One person is only allowed to marry one spouse at a time. Polygyny is illegal. And there's currently a great legal debate in the U.S. over whether individuals of the same sex can get married or not. But in many cases around the world, or again historically from the ethnographic record, we know that there are restrictions based on class, age, clan, relatedness, and many other social taboos or limitations to marriage. So what are the marriage systems? We're just going to be discussing the three main marriage systems we see in humans. There are, of course, many individual variants upon each of these. But in general, we'll be talking about polygyny. This is one husband with multiple wives. Poly means many. Gyne is the root for female, like gynecologist. So polygyny means multiple wives, one husband. Monogamy, one marriage, essentially. So this is the traditional form of marriage in the United States. One wife and one husband. And polyandry. So poly, again, is many. Andra is the root for male, like androgen. Testosterone is an androgen. And this means that there's one wife with multiple husbands. And this does occur around the world, but it is quite rare and often situational. So here's the breakdown of percentages of these different types of marriages around the world. And this is percentages of societies, not percentage of people. So polygyny, either general or limited, is about 75% of societies around the world. A lot of societies either allow polygyny or it's the preferred form of marriage. Monogamy occurs in about 24% of societies, and polyandry in just 1%. And these are often the harshest environments or the lowest class males. And we'll discuss when we see each of these arise. So our question today is, how do we explain variation within and across human societies and other species? This is the question for the class, but today we're just going to be discussing marriage. And we're going to take our cue from the animal literature and look at how other species arrive at different forms of mating. So while these are different varieties of marriage, we can also apply these to many other animal species. In some species like gorillas, polygyny is the primary form of mating, where you have one alpha male with his harem of females. In titi monkeys, as you've been reading about in Sarah Hrdy, usually monogamous, one male, one female per territory. And in tamarins and marmosets, usually we see polyandrous matings, one female with multiple males. So we can use these examples from other species and try to look at what constraints might be placed on human mating systems and how socioecology might play a role. If you remember, socioecology just means how societies or social relationships can be influenced by local ecologies. So in many species, but not all, and there are many notable exceptions, female distribution in space is largely determined by resource availability. Female reproductive success is usually based on amount of calories a female can consume. The more calories she can consume, the more infants she can rear. So females are usually constrained by resource availability. They have to go where the food is. Males in many species have their reproduction constrained by their access to females. So they can eat as many calories as they want, but their reproductive success is dependent on how many matings they can secure. So in general socio-ecological principles, we say that females follow the resources and males follow the females. There's a lot of exceptions to this in the animal kingdom and in humans, but we'll take this as our premise and see if there are any constraints for human marriage systems. So let's talk about polygyny first. One husband with plural wives. Depending on the data, so this comes from a different source. In this source, 83% of societies worldwide are polygynous, so anywhere from 75 to 83. Polygyny is much more common for high-status men, and polygyny is often sororal, meaning sisters are co-wives. And here's just some examples of polygyny from around the world. And we should remember that polygyny are official wives who have entered into the marriage contract. We'll discuss extra-pair copulations, meaning mateships outside of the marriage, at the end of lecture. So how do we see humans arriving at polygyny? What are some routes to polygyny? Well, if females are constrained by resources, we see one option would be for males to defend resources, and if you can defend enough resources to support multiple females, then perhaps you can take multiple wives. Another option for males is to defend the females instead of the resources. So if you can monopolize a group of females, then again you can acquire multiple wives. So as long as males are able to control access to either resources or females, then they might be able to be polygynous. So let's look at resource defense polygyny. Males who can acquire enough resources or control enough resources to attract multiple wives might be able to be polygynous. From the husband's point of view, you're trying to acquire enough resources or control enough resources. From the wife's point of view, she might be thinking that it's better to be a rich co-wife than a poor single wife. So if you were given the choice of marrying a homeless person on the corner or Bill Gates and be his second wife, you might think carefully about that decision and decide that it is in fact perhaps better to be a rich co-wife. Again, it's kind of down to personal preferences, and there is not any one uniform pattern. But we can look at this using what we call a polygyny threshold model. And this research comes from the Kipsigis of Kenya. They're pastoralists who live in Kenya. So males acquire large herds of cattle, and females are allowed to marry polygynously. And the hypothesis is that females will base their choice of husband on the amount of resources he can provide per wife. And so Monique Borgerhoff-Mulder in the 1980s spent a lot of time living with the Kipsigis, and she found that yes, in fact, in this society, richer males get more wives. So at the bottom, we see number of acres per male. So 0 to 14 is on the very left, then 29 acres, up to 29 acres, then 30 to 58 acres, and then 59 to 300 acres. On the left, we see percent. So in this left-hand column, about 90% of males who had 0 to 14 acres had either one or two wives. On the very right, we see about 80% of males with up to 300 acres had 3 or more wives. So males with more acres for horticulture and for pastoralism did indeed acquire more wives. So males, in this case, who could compete for resources, useful to females who could use the resources to support their families, their children. The males who were more competitive had more wives, and in this society, number of wives directly correlates with number of children. But those women who did marry into polygynous unions had more competition. So this is, on the left you can see surviving offspring per wife. And if you were an only wife, you had 0 co-wives, you had on average 7 kids. If you had one additional co-wife, you had about almost 7 kids. If you had 2 additional co-wives, on average you were having 5.5 kids. But then that number starts to go up again with 3 plus co-wives. So more co-wives does equal more competition, even though there are more resources available. So we see women following this polygyny threshold model in general, at least among the Kipsigis, but there are other things to consider when it comes to competition for resources controlled by the husband. One consequence of polygyny that we have to consider before we move on to mate defense is that polyandry, multiple husbands per wife, is actually a consequence of polygyny. And think about it this way. Human sex ratios at birth are always about 50-50. There are slightly more males than females born. It's usually about 104 boy babies to every 100 girl babies. This is because, essentially, as we'll see later, testosterone is a poison and boy babies are more likely to die. But in general, let's say sex ratios are 50-50. That means if one man has 3 wives, there are 2 men out there with no wives. And one option for these 2 men, who are usually low status, low numbers of resources, is to cooperate together, pool their resources, pool their status, and together marry one wife. And this happens quite frequently among the Yanomamo, where low status men are fraternally polyandrous. So in Chegnon's records, there was 9 polyandrous unions, and 7 of these were fraternal, so 2 brothers marrying 1 woman. So this is often an unseen consequence of polygyny. So let's talk about mate defense polygyny. In this case, males are not competing for access to resources, they're competing directly for access to females, for mates. And males compete differently in general than females. at least in different ways and at different intensities than females do. That's not to say that females don't compete for access to mates. They definitely do, but males tend to compete in different ways, and again, I'm speaking in generalities. There's a lot of variation between societies and within societies. But if we look at the male anatomy and the female anatomy, there are biological differences in proportion of fat and muscles, and there's difference in physiology, like hormones, notably estrogen and testosterone. And this different physiology tends to produce what we call sexual dimorphism. Sexual dimorphism means two sizes dimorph between the sexes. So when we have sexual dimorphism, we see a difference in size between the sexes. Often this is differences in body size, canine size, musculature, and behavior. And gorillas being a polygynous species and orangutans being a polygynous species as well, we see differences in sizes between the males and the females, as you can see in the picture here. Male gorillas can be up to 2 times the size of female gorillas. They have much larger canine, larger amounts of musculature, and different types of aggressive behavior. And the reasoning goes that in species with polygynous mating systems, males who are more competitive get more mates. So gorillas practice mate defense polygyny. They have a harem of females. Other males who don't have any mates, because sex ratios in gorillas are 50-50 as well, try to compete for access to the females. Males either have to fight their way into a harem or fight to defend their harem. And the males who are competitive tend to get access to females. The characteristics that make these males more competitive, who allow them access to females because they successfully fought off other males, these are the males who get to reproduce, the competitive ones. That means that the babies that are produced are from males who are competitive, so these characteristics will get passed on to their offspring. And this can result in sexual dimorphism. So things that make you more competitive, like large canines and increased body size, will make you more reproductively successful, which means that your sons will inherit these traits and they will be more likely to be competitive themselves. So we see an increase in body size or an increase in canine size, or the maintenance of large body size, large canine size. And if we look at different mating systems among the primates, you can see here I've highlighted the single male, multi-female in blue, and species with single male, multi-female mating systems have larger body size dimorphism, so the males are larger than females, and they have much larger canine size. The males have larger canine size than females. If you compare this to pair living in red, the monogamous species, you can see that there's very little difference between body size in males and females, and very little difference in canine size between males and females. But in polygynous mating systems, where males have to actively compete to defend females, we see the sexual dimorphism occurring. Humans are slightly sexual dimorphic, and this indicates that perhaps a history of male-male competition, even if that's not necessarily the case. Currently, we might have inherited these characteristics from a perhaps slightly polygynous mating system in the past. Now you've been reading Sarah Hrdy, and you know that there is a lot of investment in females and their offsprings from males. But we can see that the average height, for example, males are on average taller than females. And there's also differences in muscle mass, bone mass in some areas like brow ridges and jaw size. This is just bone mass in general. Males in general have more bone mass than females. So we're sexually dimorphic in a lot of ways. Some of these may be related to mating competition. Some of them may be due to differences in other differences in physiology. But perhaps there is this in our past. And we observe some differences in behavior as well. So this data comes from the Donner Party, who were traveling into California. They got stuck up near Lake Tahoe in the Sierras, were snowed in for the winter, and many individuals, most of the males, starved to death. But before they even got there, these are differences in deaths due to disease, accident, murder, questionable reason, and starvation. First of all, you can see overall many more males died than females, and notably males were more prone to disease, accident, and murder. And in fact, there were 4 murders among the party before they even got to their winter camp. So males are much more likely to die from accidents, from getting in fights, from diseases, and from starvation. Now, there's 2 things going on here. Most of these behaviors are the product or part of the consequence of testosterone. And I mentioned earlier that testosterone can be considered a poison. Well, greater amounts of testosterone correlate with greater amounts of aggression, so it's no surprise that males are more likely to murder one another. But testosterone is also an immunosuppressant, and testosterone produces more muscle mass, which is more prone to heat loss and burns more calories. So males are in general more prone to disease and starvation than females. But testosterone also can increase male competition for mates. So this is perhaps another example of sexual dimorphism, and perhaps a consequence of a potential history of mate defense polygyny. So let's talk about monogamy now. One husband, one wife. We have many associations with monogamy, such as increased male parental care, and this is true across species, like many species of songbirds, and we've seen some examples in the primate world also. One association with monogamy is that the distribution of females may not allow males to monopolize more than one female. So let's look at 2 roots to monogamy. First of all, it might be that males are not able to monopolize resources or monopolize females. So you might not be able to gather enough resources in one place to support more than one wife, or females might be scattered widely over the landscape, so it's very difficult to defend multiple wives at one time. Or we also see increased paternal care requiring males who must invest a lot in each offspring. They're only able to invest in the offspring of one woman. So the first we call ecologically imposed monogamy, and we see this in many foraging societies. A lot of foraging societies do allow polygyny, but it's very difficult to acquire enough resources in any one person to be able to support multiple wives. And this is probably a consequence of foraging society today being limited to marginal habitats. All of the good land is taken by agriculturalists, essentially. But in any case, when there just aren't simply enough resources in the environment for one person to monopolize enough to support multiple spouses, we generally see monogamy as being the preferred form of marriage. We also see socially imposed monogamy, and this occurs in many societies where offspring require a lot of investment. Industrial societies are a good example of this. So socially, polygyny is forbidden, and this is usually over concerns about spousal or child support in societies where children require a lot of investment. Some associations with monogamy include increased male parental care. Monogamous marriages increase paternity certainty. When you're the only mate of a spouse, then you're fairly sure of your children's paternity. Increased male parental care can increase the reproductive success, that's what RS is abbreviated for, of offspring. Or, as I said, female distribution may not allow males to monopolize more than one female. And we generally see this in hunter-gatherers or highly stratified societies of Western European origin. So let's discuss polyandry. One wife, multiple husbands. First of all, as you've seen, it's very rare. And it usually occurs when either mates, such as in the Yanomamo, or resources, such as in this example in the Tibetan plateau, when either of these are very limited. It's usually fraternal, and often polyandry is associated with polygyny, such as in low-status Yanomamo men or other men and low-status men in polygynous societies. Let's look at fraternal polyandry in Tibetan Nepal. This is a very harsh environment. There's quite restricted resources, and oftentimes we see brothers sharing an estate and each brother will engage in a different task. So the ideal form of marriage here in polyandry is actually the preferred form of marriage, the high status type of marriage. You'll have one brother herding, one brother farming, and one brother engaging in long distance trade. And by the cooperation of all three brothers, because the environment is so harsh, they can support the reproductive efforts of one woman. So resources and environment can definitely constrain the amount of spouses that one person can care for. So let's talk about one thing I promised you I was going to discuss: extra pair copulations. This is the twist. The marriage and the mating system, the official social system, is not always equal to the breeding system. And when people are mating with individuals outside of their marriage, we tend to call these extra pair copulations. Extra pair copulations might be valuable because they could increase the genetic variability of offspring, so not all of your offspring have the same father or mother. You might take advantage of extra pair copulations if you have low or lower mate value and someone of higher mate value comes along. You couldn't attract them as a permanent mate, but perhaps you could attract them and fool your partner into helping raise the offspring. Or maybe you can convince someone to invest in your offspring when they are not the parent. So some alternative mating strategies include serial monogamy. So you might have a few highly competitive men can monopolize more than one female reproductive lifespan. So you might see one man having several different wives over the course of his lifespan. And this also creates greater amounts of male-male competition. We're going to be discussing mating attractiveness and human mate choice in the next lecture. But I hope you enjoyed this lecture on human marriage, and thanks for listening.